To all those who are watching, welcome. Our session today will be on regional solutions for rural and urban challenges, and our presenter today is Brian Dapson. Brian Dapson is a research fellow, School of Government, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, senior research fellow, Urban Institute, University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and advisor, Locus Impact Investing. His interests now focus on regional and rural development. Before moving to North Carolina, he was Associate Dean, Research Professor, and Director of the Institute of Public Policy at the University of Missouri Harry Truman School of Public Affairs. Previous positions include President of the Rural Policy Research Institute and President of CFAD. I am now going to pass it on to Brian.
Thank you, Nazarene. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for spending time to hear about a project that I'm currently working on. We are close to finishing, and we shall probably be publishing via our website and other means in the spring. But we are pretty close to having completed our work on this. As Nazarene said, this is a project called Regional Solutions to Rural and Urban Challenges. The working hypothesis that we used was that regional collaboration and solution seeking can be an effective way of improving social and economic opportunity and health for all people and all places within a region. In the United States, since 2016, there has been a lot of heart-searching and hand-wringing about rural America, and particularly about the narrative of the urban-rural divide. So in some small way, this is an attempt to look for some alternative narratives based on regional approaches. The objectives of our work has been to identify examples of policy and practice across the country that demonstrate the crossing of boundaries, multi-sector solutions as public, private, non-profit to regional challenges, and which intentionally advance notions of equity, of opportunity, health, and well-being within a region. And by doing all this, we're hoping that we can share our learning and our insights to inform policy, practice, and research. The process is fairly standard. We've undertaken a pretty extensive literature review, both academic and more recent gray literature. We spoke to 50 experts and stakeholders around the country, and we identified in the first instance about 65 possible sites where we might do some case studies. Through a process which I'll just describe in a minute, we eventually got ourselves down to 7 places where we conducted fairly lengthy site visits. We have just completed the synthesis process of pulling it all together, and we're now, well, we will be after the holiday, really getting into how we're going to communicate these findings to a broader audience, although of course today is one such communication. The criteria we used for selecting the case studies were of 2 sorts. One was the threshold criteria. We were looking for examples which showed rural-urban linkage in some explicit way. We're looking for ways in which equity could be addressed, obviously collaboration and multi-sector. Now, we were not looking to evaluate projects. We were looking for projects from which we could learn. So what we eventually chose are not necessarily the best of their kind, but the ones where we thought we could learn the most. We obviously also applied diversity criteria in terms of geographic spread, the nature of the collaborative structure, the sort of issue areas that these initiatives were involved in, and the sort of populations that they focused their attention on. So the 7 areas or 7 sites that we looked at was an interesting distribution in the end, because many United States studies tend to stay east of the Mississippi, whereas this time we were primarily west of the Mississippi, with 4 right on the west coast. So 2 in the Washington, Oregon area, Craft 3, Sustainable Northwest, 2 in California, Sacramento Area Council of Governments and the Partnership for the San Joaquin Valley, the Amarillo Area Foundation in the Texas Panhandle, the state of Minnesota, and then Western North Carolina with the Land of Sky Council of Governments. The other stars are ones which were in the final due diligence but didn't make it to the final 7 that we visited. So the 7 case studies represent quite different types of organization. Community development financial institution, non-profit, councils of government, public-private partnerships, community foundation, and a whole statewide system. So they're quite different in their structure and their origins. And they also fairly different in terms of their coverage. All of them covered a region, that is at least 4 counties. Some covered a whole state. Some had interventions in a couple of states. But they are quite different in terms of their origins and their activities. A couple of them have been around for at least 25 years, and one is just getting off the ground. But there's quite a variety of case studies there that we looked at. I want to focus our attention, however, rather than the specifics of the sites, and talk about what we think we learned from these investigations. And our insights can be grouped into 5: the nature of rural-urban connections, the policy and political context, equity, collaboration, and then regional innovation. Now, as many of you who've been working in this field will be more than well aware, that rural-urban connections can take very many different forms. Clearly, supply chains linking suppliers of products to ultimate consumers, ecosystem services, the management of water supplies, forestry products and the like, the provision of materials and natural resources, and then also commuting patterns, the effects of urban expansion, and what we've called collective identities, which are people who still have family connections back in rural, that they live in either suburban or urban locations. And we saw this all came from the literature, but we also saw this, each of these have importance in each of the sites that we saw. We also saw, to some extent, the support for the econometric models that tend to show that the benefits of rural-urban interactions generally favor urban centers. And we saw, as I say, we saw some support for that. But I think the thing that really struck us, certainly in some of the sites, was the fact that the contributions that rural economies, rural communities make to the regional whole were very often hidden in plain sight. People knew that there was rural, that you bought things from rural, but it's safe to say that in most cases, the actual contributions that rural made were unrecognized, undervalued, and unmonetized, which had some serious impact on the way people gave priority to investments in rural areas. We also saw that the historic rural-urban compact, which had been around for 100 years or more, is now frayed, that we are talking constantly about the rural-urban divide, and that most things reduce themselves to zero-sum arguments in terms of resources. But one of the things that was positive about this is the number of people we spoke to who saw a way forward, using the argument that if everyone benefits, everybody will benefit if both urban and rural are doing well, and made this as a case for seeking balanced investments across urban and rural as a sort of counterpoint to the natural tendency for investment to concentrate in urban locations. Now, it was very hard to get away from the political context. Power disparities between rural and urban are very real. But again, the folks we talked to felt that by consolidating voices to try and combat regional power differences, and by focusing on issues that are common to both rural and urban, and preferably require statewide action, can, to a degree, deal with some of these power disparities. But the thing that was the elephant in every room was the general context of polarization at the national level, which filters its way right down to the local level. And regional collaboration, which is hard in any place, is made even harder by these strong political divides. But folks have made conscientious efforts to check partisanship at the door, and have found that if this is done properly, it can be a good strategy to address these divides. Many people talked about the fact that hostage taking now is the normal approach, which has replaced horse trading, which makes negotiations over resource allocation much more difficult. And this takes us back to the point about the need to highlight the contribution that rural economies make to the overall economy. And if this is done properly, then it can lead to shifts in priorities and in public investments. Without that highlighting of the contribution, then we have this narrative that people are wasting resources by putting anything towards rural. The other contextual thing which was really important in some places was the sometimes decades of concerted efforts that have been made through public and philanthropic policy and investment to create a really positive environment for building and sustaining regional institutions and capacity. We saw this both in Minnesota and in California, and it makes all the difference in the world in terms of the effectiveness of regional approaches if you have a very strong and well-established policy context behind it. But we also saw in certain places where particularly state policies and regulations can be very damaging and can inhibit collaborations and actions at the regional level. Now, equity was an important thing for our study. Our funder, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, was particularly interested in equity, and we found that regional context matters a lot, particularly as we were out west, where minority populations were somewhat less, primarily white populations, but there were other differences which were important to recognize around income, gender, and class, as well as race. But in other parts of the country, race was the predominant thing that needed to be paid attention to. Now, both the federal government and the large philanthropies have been driving consideration of equity more recently through diversity, equity and inclusion requirements in funding. And this has been fairly influential even in some fairly remote rural areas. We also saw targeted programs which were focused on specific inequities. The most obvious ones were around Indian country tribal reservations, but we also saw programs around access to business capital and also around access to broadband, the digital divide. Another thing which we saw was that in all the areas we looked at, there were some fairly dramatic demographic changes taking place with new immigrants, particularly Hispanic immigrants, coming into communities which had not witnessed any change other than gradual decline. And there was a real focus on capacity building to enable new immigrants to be welcomed into the communities, and the need for a process for gaining community acceptance and integration. And we saw also that equity has been promoted in many of the regions we saw by giving voice to groups and communities around the region who would not otherwise participate in decision making. This is pretty new and to some extent is also driven by federal and other requirements, because regional planning and regional discussions tend to be a little dry, tend to be bring in the usual suspects, but they're finding ways in which communities and groups from across state who don't normally participate have been given a route in through some of these regional approaches. And of course, you can't talk about regional approaches without focusing in on collaboration. And of the case studies we looked at, that we saw very different degrees of formality around collaboration, from very highly evolved statewide and multi-state alliances. We saw collaboration which was incented and encouraged by funders, or it was built into the original institution design, or just remained informal as contacts between people who basically got on well and figured out ways of collaborating. The theme that we came back to again and again was this notion of soft power. The regional organizations that we looked at were not formally constituted by federal government of the sort like such as the Appalachian Regional Commission or the Delta Regional Commission. These were organizations which rarely had any powers of coercion or taxation, and they relied exclusively on education, on persuasion, cooperation, and advocacy to get anything done. Clearly, the fact that they often lacked the resources and capacities created challenges of implementation. But in all cases, we saw ingenuity, creativity used, and actually looking for collaborators across public, private, and non-profit sectors for new initiatives and organizations to be introduced, agreements brokered on contentious issues, and influencing in some ways flows of resources within a region and from outside the region. So we saw some interesting examples of that in collaboration. And we also saw what we might call examples of regional innovation. The extent to which these seem innovative from a Canadian perspective, you'll have to tell me, but one of the things we saw particularly in Minnesota, but to a limited extent elsewhere, was the notion of regional ecosystems. Whole layers of institutions and systems that work collaboratively and consistently in ways that they were able to coordinate and pool their resources and expertise and work across multiple issues in a region. So you would have public sector organizations, you'd have community foundations, you'd have the private sector partnerships in different ways, all figuring as part of an ecosystem with a very strong regional orientation. The second thing we saw was that these institutions that we looked at were really agents for transformation and reinvention. As I mentioned, each of these areas was undergoing some interesting demographic change. Most of them have been going through major economic and structural changes, whether it's to do with farming or mining or lumber, whether it's the encroachment of urban development, the arrival of new economic opportunities and new populations. But the transformation was underway, and this transformation was far beyond what an individual small local government could deal with. But if they work together in a regional context, these things seem to be a little more manageable, and it was possible to think more broadly about what one could do to manage transformation. This, again, may seem a little obvious, but certainly in the United States, community development and economic development tend to be on parallel tracks and hit each other by coincidence rather than by intentionality. But we saw in these case studies real strong ways of integrating community and economic development, recognizing that affordable housing, the availability of childcare, decent healthcare, workforce preparation, transportation, the quality of air and water were all necessary preconditions for economic development. They were all part of community development. So one didn't talk about these as being separate buckets. They were all things that had to be addressed in a regional context. And the final one, which we saw in a couple of instances where institutions will begin to invest in those communities which were showing stronger, but using their assets as their basis for development, sort of place-based strategies to try and stabilize their surrounding rural regions. I think we would need to do more work on that, but it was certainly something we saw some evidence of as small, thriving rural centers being the sort of hub for surrounding rural regions. So from all this work, we've begun to identify some principles and also develop some recommendations. And I should say at this point that both the principles and the recommendations are in development. We are in discussion with a foundation and with the sites that we've seen to make sure that we're seeing what we're responding properly to what we think we saw. So the principles are, first of all, there has to be a deep understanding of context if regional collaboration and decision making is to happen. It can't be imposed arbitrarily from outside. It requires trusted institutions with deep roots and strong analytical capacity. This contextual thing kept hitting us on just about every site and in every conversation, is that you really do need to understand the historical, the cultural, the economic, the geographic context as a basis for effective regional collaboration. The second principle takes us back to making the case, addressing the hidden in plain sight problem. We really do need to figure out better ways of presenting and calculating the contributions that rural economies make to the overall regional economy. And part of that is facilitating conversations across regions, between communities, and build the foundation for regional collaboration. One of the things which was very evident is that we need to go way beyond just seeking public input to strategies and plans which we've dreamt up in an office. It has to be active engagement with communities in setting priorities and driving change, which takes us back to the notion of trusted institutions. If we talk about ecosystems again, it's really important to be able to map those properly. We know, as we've said before, that these different functions of housing and childcare and healthcare and the like, they're all interdependent and they're essential to creating and sustaining healthy economies and communities. But we also know that each of those topics has its own systems and networks of advocates and agencies and funding sources and research specialists and political constituencies. So the regional level, we have to figure out ways of connecting these systems and networks into regional ecosystems, and mapping those is a really important first and actually continuing step. In terms of mobilizing resources, regional approaches within the United States are not well funded. They're done on a shoestring, and what is needed is multi-year public, both federal and state funding and philanthropic funding to create and sustain the regional infrastructure, the regional ecosystems which I talked about. We also need to figure out ways of amplifying voice, particularly for communities which are not usually at the table. So adopting strong regional structures provides venues for these communities and interests to be at that table and to be part of the decision-making process. So getting back to the objective of this exercise, or at least the hypothesis that improving social and economic opportunity and health for all people and all places within a region, rural and urban, does require intentionality in striving for equity across these different facets of geography, race and ethnicity and what have you, so that they're all integral part of regional solution seeking. So these are, you probably can't read all the small print, and that's probably deliberate because we're still fine-tuning the recommendations. But the way we're heading is that we're trying to identify sets of things that regional development organizations can do together, state governments, community development financial institutions, philanthropy, and higher education. And we've been identifying trade associations, networks in these different blocks, and giving them ideas for what they might want to do to improve regional efforts. So for instance, in regional development organizations, we'd like to see some changes in the way federal funding operates to enable regional development organizations, councils of government and the like, better serve the interests of rural communities and facilitate these inclusive planning processes that I talked about. Another example would be the community development financial institutions. These organizations are generally, they're recognized by the US Treasury, and they're really dependent to a large extent on the activities encouraged by the Community Reinvestment Act to get banks to invest in the areas from which they take deposits. there needs to be some further tweaking to the Community Reinvestment Act to stimulate more bank investment in rural, to invest more in CDFIs and rural markets, and to provide incentives for collaboration across the different sectors. So we've identified quite a shopping list of things that these different institutions should look at. And given that this probably is primarily a higher education audience, so I'm not absolutely sure about that, we've also suggested some areas where there needs to be further academic research and extension engagement around things such as valuation of rural contributions, about how do you introduce engagement strategies across a region, getting people involved, how do you strengthen ecosystems across different functions, and how do you really integrate intentional equity into regional policy making and resource allocations. We saw some inklings of all those, but we need to know a lot more in order to get better action. So that, I think, is a quick canter through the work that we've been doing over the past year. And as I said at the beginning, we'll be sharing the detail of all this through our web presence, which is going to be put together early in the new year. So I'll now open things up for questions and for discussion. Manzaline?
Thank you, Brian, for your great presentation. It was very informative. So we did have a few questions pop up. The first question is, what was the balance for collaborating between being pragmatic and particulars such as cost considerations, implementation feasibility, versus doing it because it was optically good, fashionable, expected, and otherwise expected, versus it has to be done this way because of funding and pragmatic requirements?
Oh, okay. I think the questioner has hit a number of different bases. And it depends on which case study we were looking at. Some of the case studies actually saw collaboration as being absolutely critical to the way they do business. As an individual organization or as an individual institution, they couldn't do anything like what they needed to do in their area without formally reaching out to other people with the resources and expertise. So I think for most of the ones we looked at, collaboration was seen as an essential part of what needed to be done. That doesn't mean to say that funding very often has conditions attached to it, which says you must collaborate with these types of interests. So that's certainly there. But I didn't detect from any of the case studies we looked at collaborating or talking about collaboration because it was fashionable or because it was the trendy thing to do. This was much more serious and embedded than that element might suggest.
Thank you. The second question is, did the balance in numbers at the table make any difference? Example, one large metropolitan partners with its own critical mass and a gathering of smaller urban jurisdictions with a variety of agendas and priorities, and usually lacking critical mass, even if they have some commonalities.
Right. A good question, and certainly some of the cases we looked at had some pretty substantial metropolitan cores to them, with considerable amount of expertise and resources, which wasn't necessarily shared with the rural areas to begin with, but at least they had the framework for getting things done. we were a little concerned about the fact that, and in a way, it was a function of the fact that we were looking at rural-urban connections, but we were also concerned about what happens in those regions where the urban center isn't quite as dominant or isn't as well resourced. And we actually went out and conducted an interesting meeting earlier this month in the Delta region. We met in Memphis, Tennessee, and we pulled together a number of regional focused organizations there. And the Delta, as you probably will be aware, is an area of long-term entrenched poverty. It has history of racial discrimination and disinvestment. But although there are cities around the perimeter, there isn't much inside, and therefore a lot of smaller rural communities, rural small towns. And there they found that collaboration was extremely hard. Now, what I'm not sure from the evidence we saw, whether this was a function of the particular history and context of the place, or whether that's something that we're bound to find in other areas where the urban centers are not as well developed, or where you're talking about lots of rural communities trying to collaborate together without much resource. So I think there's more work to be done on that, but I was intrigued particularly in places like Minnesota, where most of the energy of the state is focused in the twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, with smaller cities dotted around, that with a strong regional infrastructure supported by foundations and the way that the state government is organized, we're able to get people around the table and to figure out together regional strategies. So there is a way of doing this. It depends on the institutional context as to how effective that's going to be. I hope I've answered the question properly.
Thank you. Next question. How do you call upon trusted institutions with deep roots in context of change, turmoil, uncertain transitions, and flux? There is little stability here. Many institutions will have what heard in serial declines. Others will be new and foreign to many participants.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think the first point to make is that I don't think you're going to get effective regional collaboration unless you've got people who really know their area well and who are trusted. But I understand that sometimes deep-rooted institutions can be a barrier to getting anything done. And we certainly saw that in the South, where the people who've been running things for forever tend to want to keep running them and want to exclude new voices and new approaches in their communities. And that's common right across the country, and I guess it's pretty common in Canada too. So there's a conundrum here about how do you make sure that the right voices are at the table to get things done. I think if you're talking about a region where most of the older institutions have gone away or they've lost their credibility, then clearly you're talking about building new institutions over time, figuring out new ways of collaborating so that you can bring your limited resources and technical expertise together around the table to try and solve problems. But one clear message to me is that unless there's trust, unless there's credibility in the people who are sitting around the table amongst each other, then you're not going to get effective regional collaboration. Nobody ever said that this was an easy thing, and everybody we talked to said regional collaboration, regional working is hard, it's time consuming, it's expensive, and clearly it's a good those are good reasons why some people won't even bother to consider that as a serious option in their region. But again, the same people would say, however, we have no choice. We can't do this on our own. The resources, particularly in the rural communities, are getting less and less. They can't just try and solve all these major problems on their own. The way we do this is by figuring out a way of how we can collaborate, how we can come up with a joint vision for the future we're facing.
Thank you. Next question. Are there some consistent starting places for regional development? If communities in an area are wanting to start working together, what are the low-hanging fruits to help get them started?
These are all very good questions. My starting point probably is that certainly in the United States, there's a whole network of regional development organizations. These are variously called councils of government, regional development commissions, regional planning commissions, and they cover pretty much every county and every tribal reservation in the country. Some of them are very, very good, and some of them basically don't work well at all. But at least it's an institutional infrastructure which you can begin to build upon. So that seems to me to be one thing to look at is, do we have existing vehicles which we can build, use as a platform to build new collaboration? Another possibility which seems to be getting some traction is the notion of community foundations. Looking for ways in which philanthropy can be not just a means of supporting myriad small good causes around the place, but can be a method of convening, of bringing people to the table and getting folks to talk in a safe place about issues that are of concern to them. So I tend to begin by looking at those sorts of institutional possibilities and seeing what can be done around there. I'd love to see federal, state, and large philanthropies investing in these sorts of regional institutions, subject to certain safeguards as a way of getting forward, moving forward. But at the end of the day, it's about how people who care about their own communities and who are concerned about the way things are sliding, figure out a way to come together across the public, private, and non-profit sectors. We've seen lots of good evidence of small towns, small communities using asset-based strategies and planning to be able to identify what their strengths are and try and build upon those in small ways. I think the same basic principle applies to regions of thinking about what can we build upon, who do we have here who could be part of this new approach, and where can we get resources to help us move forward. But I guess the thing that I need to stress is that some of the better examples that we saw are the result of 25, 30 years of continuing effort and investment. So I get the question as well, if you don't have that, where do you start? And I think through the existing structures, even if they are dormant, is a good way at least to begin the conversation.
Thank you. We have another question. Were initiatives made primarily by urban or non-urban participants? Many of the initiatives I know were the results of strong non-urban regions taking the initiatives for projects and collaborations.
Yeah. Again, I don't think I could generalize. I think you'll find examples where the rural communities took the lead because there was something that they really needed to get done. The argument is whether or not rural communities are best served by trying to go it alone, or whether they try and forge relationships with their urban neighbors. My prejudice is that in the longer term, figuring out ways for rural and urban to work together is the way forward. But I certainly would suggest that it's the only approach that rural communities could take. Working together to pool their resources and move forward seems to be a particularly powerful way forward. But it's all about context, and it's all about who holds the power and who holds the resources. In some parts of the country, the rural politics are such that they own what's going on in the state. And we learned about this when we were in the Delta, is that in Arkansas, for instance, it is the rural communities which actually drive policy and strategies there. When you look a little deeper, however, it's you have to ask the question, who in the rural communities is driving, and is that for the benefit of everybody who lives there? But we've also seen good examples where the urban folks have looked outwards and said, well, what is it that we can do together? We have an interest in clean water or clean air. We have interest in natural resources or in recreation. What can we do together to be able to figure out joint strategies? So I think it can go either way. And I think you can probably find good examples of both rural and urban generated approaches to regionalism.
Thank you. Another question is, could you please clarify what you meant by hostage taking versus horse trading? Is this a reference to natural resources?
Okay. Maybe I'm never sure these days, because I've lived in the States for too long, as to whether some of my phrases are English in orientation or American, but probably neither of them fly in Canada. Basically, what I mean is that, putting it in a different way, it's almost like in olden days, but it's not that long ago, when it was perfectly normal for people on different sides of an issue to sit down and try and figure out a compromise. I'll give you this if you give me that. And that was certainly a feature of discussion between rural and urban in terms of how do you get the right balance of resources and investment, assuming, of course, that the power differential was not too great. Where we are now in so many cases, and we heard this again and again, was that people aren't interested in looking for compromise. It's all or nothing, or they regard things as a zero-sum game. So if in terms of total state budget or regional budget, I represent an urban constituency, I'm going to fight tooth and nail to make sure that pretty much all the education and all the social services money and transportation dollars benefit my urban constituency, and that anything that the rural takes is a loss for me. So thinking in terms of winning and losing on around fixed amounts of investment becomes the way things are done. And that was characterized certainly in Minnesota as hostage taking. We're not going to be moved and we're not going to compromise, versus the horse trading, which is all about compromise. I hope that makes it clear. But we're really just addressing the political reality that we're certainly facing in the US at the moment. It makes it very hard for collaborative approaches.
Our next question is, do you have experience with involving Indigenous communities in these types of approaches?
Indigenous communities? Yes, in the particularly in the two cases we looked at in the Pacific Northwest, in Washington, Oregon. Both of the organizations had a pretty good experience of working with the tribes in those regions. Now, it has to be said that it is hard, and we also heard stories where it's been really difficult. And part of it is that the tribes, the Indian nations, because of sovereignty, would have a preference for negotiating direct with the federal government, do not like working directly with state agencies or with other bodies where there is some issue over recognition of sovereignty and rights and the rest of it. However, the two organizations that we focused on, CRAFT-3, which is a community development financial institution, and Sustainable Northwest, which is an advocacy technical assistance nonprofit, they were able to get around all that because they were focusing on issues which were of importance to the tribes, and they figured out a way to work collaboratively. In fact, an example I might give is in both Oregon and Washington, there are things called forest collaboratives, which are ways in which communities and the forestry and environmental and local government interests come together to create sustainable forest plans. These were a direct offshoot of 25 years ago, where there was major contention in the woods as on public lands. So there are several examples of forest collaboratives where the tribes themselves are at the table, and there is one example where a tribe is actually the leader of the collaborative, running the collaborative, but inviting other interests to the table. So I think it's hard, and it has to be done with great care, and has to be done with, over a period of time. But certainly the 2 or 3 examples we saw showed that it is possible with care to work with Indigenous communities in this way.
Thank you. Next question. The existence of many formal institutions with different definitions of regions have often fragmented the ability of regional people and groups to learn and develop the trust required. Do you have examples where common organizational definitions or structures help the process, or whether the fragmentation is an important barrier? Is there a policy proposal that may arise from this?
Yes, good. Certainly fragmentation is an issue. Multiple definitions of regions is an issue in a large part of the United States. In Minnesota, where we sort of lifted up the notion of regional ecosystems, the state some years ago was faced with, I think I'm right in saying, 70 different organizations, regional organizations, with different boundaries, different constituencies, different funding streams. And fragmentation was very much the overwhelming characteristic of that thing. The state, through legislation, came up with, I think it was 8 regions, created regional development commissions for each of those regions, and then encouraged, if that's the right word, other state agencies to adopt the same regional definitions. So that over time, this didn't happen overnight, but over time, you've got just about every state agency and every public-private effort using the same regional boundaries to get things done. And as a consequence, you lay a very good foundation for collaboration across all these agencies. You haven't got this challenge as was described, the fragmentation. Unfortunately, I don't think Minnesota is a common example, but it does suggest at the state level that there might be some work done to look at the boundaries and make sure that state agencies and regional commissions and the like in some way are brought together in some sort of logical regional framework. What logical regional framework means will differ obviously from state to state and political context, but that would seem to be a sort of interesting policy possibility there.
Thank you. So here's another question or a thought, I believe. So have not mentioned of capacity development, maybe it is coming. This is surprising as the presentation seems to place some stress on social learning by another name, patience, and finding one's way across a risky collaborative venture. All of this in addition to the urban versus rural popular culture.
Capacity building is actually a theme which comes through the recommendations that we're making. It is within the much of the writing that we've done so far. So yes, capacity building, bringing voices to the table, figuring out how you can achieve some form of consensus and or have difficult discussions is all part of that, all part of that process. And certainly we've seen the important role that community foundations in particular can have in providing both the safe spaces for those conversations and in providing training and support for organizations to be able to work in this collaborative space. So yes, indeed, the notion of capacity at the community level and also reorienting established institutions has to be part of this this process that we're talking about now.
Thank you. So I will just take a couple more questions just because we are running out of time, but these are all great questions. So our second last question is, do you have experience outside the United States and Canada, particularly so-called third world countries? If you have, please tell us any success stories.
I'm afraid that I don't have any direct experience in developing countries. Some of the literature review that we did early on, we drew quite a lot from South America and some of the work that was going on in I think in Colombia and Brazil and Argentina, where at least looking at the relationships between rural and urban, there's been quite a lot of work through international agencies looking at what's going on in peri-urban spaces where urban and rural come together and how do you manage all that. But so there's plenty of things to read and to understand about that. And I've tried to reflect some of that learning into the literature review and the findings that we've had. But I don't have any direct experience nor specific examples I can share.
Thank you, Brian. Our last question is, I know of examples where regional collaborations among NGOs, businesses, and municipalities functioned very well until the provincial government insisted they be involved. After that, the previous collaboration dissipated. Is this common?
And need to step outside these case studies that we've been looking at and many years of experience, is that sometimes the heavy hand of federal and state governments can actually quash perfectly good grassroots efforts to collaborate and get things done. It needn't be the case. And I think there's a lot of work to be done with agencies, state and federal, to get them to understand the importance of some of these collaborative efforts, and that they should come to the table as just a partner and not as somebody who's trying to control or provide or describe some constraints upon what the collaborative can and can't do. So it requires a rather different attitude and a different approach. And I've seen it in some agencies with some people, but I think part of the ground rules, some of the ground rules that we probably have to establish if we're going to promote regional collaboration more broadly, is a different way in which the agencies come to the table and how they participate. Just because they come from the state capital or from the federal capital does not mean that they have the right to tell the local people how they should think about or do approach regional collaboration. But I take the point that's made, and I've seen it time and time again, but it needn't be the case.
Thank you, Brian. Unfortunately, this is all the time we have for all the questions. I'm sure people might have more questions for Brian, but if you do have questions, I don't think Brian would mind if you could reach him.
Right. There's my email address and my phone number. I prefer the email if possible, but happy to talk. And learn from you all as well. That's important.
Okay, and do you have anything else to add, Brian?
No, I think I've been talking for long enough. I've enjoyed the opportunity. I thank you for those who turned up and stayed with me. So, and I look forward to hearing from some of you as we move forward. And look out for our launch of this information sometime in the spring of 2020.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to once again thank you, Brian, for your great presentation. I would also like to thank the audience for attending this webinar and for their participation.